The fields around Waterloo lie heavy with water, each blade of grass bent under the weight of droplets that fell without mercy through the darkness. The earth itself seems to groan beneath the burden of moisture, transforming what should have been solid ground into a treacherous bog that will shape the destiny of Europe. In this pre-dawn darkness, before the sun dares to show its face over Belgium, three armies wait in the gloom, separated by mere miles but divided by ambitions that span continents. Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, though his empire now shrinks with each passing day, stands in his headquarters at Le Caillou farmhouse. The candles flicker against the windows streaked with rain, casting dancing shadows across maps spread upon wooden tables worn smooth by countless military consultations. His fingers, those same digits that once traced the conquest of half of Europe, now drum impatiently against the table's edge. The rain has changed everything. What should have been a dawn attack must now wait for the ground to dry, for artillery to move, for destiny to clear its throat. The emperor's face, pale in the candlelight, shows the weight of recent defeats. Leipzig, where the nations of Europe united against him. The retreat from Moscow, where winter proved a more formidable enemy than any coalition. The abdication, the exile to Elba, the 100 days of his return. All of it has led to this moment, this field, this rain-soaked morning that will determine whether the Napoleonic age continues or dies in the Belgian mud. Outside, in the pre-dawn gloom, French soldiers huddle around fires that hiss and sputter in the dampness. Their uniforms, once the terror of Europe, now hang heavy with moisture. Veterans of Austerlitz and Jena move with the careful deliberation of men who know that this day may be their last. The younger soldiers, those who joined during the desperate campaigns of recent years, watch their sergeants for signs of confidence or despair. The old guard, Napoleon's most trusted veterans, maintain their stoic silence, but even they cast glances toward the sky, wondering when the rain will stop. Miles away, on the ridge of Mont Saint-Jean, Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, commander of the Anglo-Allied army, performs his own ritual of waiting. His headquarters in the village of Waterloo buzzes with quiet activity as staff officers come and go with reports, their boots squelching in the mud that has become the day's first enemy. Wellington, the Iron Duke, victor of the Peninsular Campaign, has chosen his ground carefully. The reverse slope position he favors will protect his men from French artillery, while the farmhouses of Hougoumont and La Haye-Saint provide anchor points for his defense. The Duke's face reveals nothing of his thoughts as he studies the reports. His Anglo-Dutch-German coalition is outnumbered, containing many units of questionable reliability. The Dutch and Belgian troops who fight under his command have uncertain loyalty. Some served under Napoleon just a year ago. Only his British veterans, survivors of Spain and Portugal, can be counted upon without reservation. But Wellington has built his reputation on making the most of imperfect situations, on turning defensive positions into offensive opportunities. In the growing light, the true scope of the coming battle becomes visible. The field of Waterloo stretches like a vast amphitheater, with Wellington's forces holding the high ground and the French army spread across the valley below. Between them lie the killing fields where tens of thousands will fall before the sun sets. The rain has turned these fields into a maze of mud and standing water, making cavalry charges treacherous and artillery movements slow and laborious. Wellington's soldiers begin their own morning preparations. British redcoats, their scarlet uniforms darkened by moisture, check their muskets and wonder if the powder will stay dry. The Brunswick soldiers, distinguished by their black uniforms and death's head insignia, maintain their reputation for grim determination. Hanoverian troops, fighting for their homeland's freedom, prepare their equipment with methodical care. Throughout the Allied lines, men write letters they hope they'll never have to send, or pray to gods they hope are listening. But there is a third army on this field, one that Napoleon believes will not arrive in time to matter. Field Marshal Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher, the old Prussian warhorse, leads his army through the mud-choked roads of Belgium in a desperate race against time. At Wavre, his rearguard fights a delaying action against Marshal Grouchy's French corps, while Blücher himself pushes toward Waterloo with every man he can muster. The 72-year-old field marshal, bruised and battered from his fall at Ligny 2 days earlier, refuses to let physical pain slow his march. He knows that the fate of Europe may depend on his ability to arrive at Waterloo before Napoleon can destroy Wellington's army. The Prussian columns stretch for miles along the muddy roads, their progress measured in yards rather than miles. Artillery pieces sink to their axles in the soft ground, requiring dozens of men and horses to move each gun forward. Infantry soldiers, their blue uniforms caked with mud, lean into the wind and rain as they follow their commander toward what may be the final battle of the Napoleonic Wars. Blücher's message to Wellington is simple: hold until we arrive. As the morning progresses, the rain gradually diminishes, though the clouds remain heavy and threatening. Napoleon's artillery officers begin the slow process of moving their guns into position, each piece requiring careful maneuvering through the soft ground. The Emperor's plan is straightforward in concept but complex in execution. A diversionary attack on Hougoumont to draw Wellington's reserves, followed by a massive assault on the Allied center. If successful, this plan will split Wellington's army in two and open the road to Brussels. The French artillery park represents one of Napoleon's greatest advantages. His guns, served by crews trained in the artillery school that produced the Emperor himself, have the range and accuracy to devastate enemy formations at distances where muskets are useless. But the mud that clings to everything this morning will slow their deployment and reduce their effectiveness. Cannonballs that should bounce and ricochet through enemy ranks will instead bury themselves harmlessly in the soft earth. Wellington, observing the French preparations through his telescope, makes his own adjustments. His men, positioned on the reverse slope of the ridge, are largely invisible to French gunners. Only his skirmishers and advanced guards are exposed to enemy fire, while the main body of his army waits in relative safety behind the crest of the hill. It is a defensive strategy that has served him well in Spain, turning French advantages in artillery and numbers into liabilities. The village of Waterloo itself, which will give its name to this battle, sits quietly behind Wellington's lines. The inhabitants who have not fled watch from their windows as history prepares to unfold in their fields. The inn where Wellington has made his headquarters will become a place of pilgrimage for generations of military historians, while the church bells that ring the hours this morning will soon be drowned out by the thunder of cannon and the cries of dying men. In the French ranks, Marshal Michel Ney, the bravest of the brave, prepares for what he knows may be his final battle. His reputation as the most courageous marshal in Napoleon's service has been earned through decades of desperate fighting, but recent defeats have tarnished his standing with the Emperor. Today offers a chance for redemption, or for a glorious death that will restore his honor. His cavalry, the finest in Europe, wait for the order to charge, their horses stamping impatiently in the mud. The morning also brings news that will shape the battle's outcome, though its significance will not be understood until evening. Marshal Grouchy, commanding 30,000 French troops in pursuit of the Prussians, has allowed Blücher's main army to escape toward Waterloo. Instead of pursuing aggressively, Grouchy has been content to follow at a distance, convinced that the Prussians are retreating toward their supply lines rather than moving to support Wellington. This mistake will prove catastrophic for Napoleon's chances of victory. As the sun climbs higher, burning away some of the morning mist, the true magnitude of the armies becomes visible. Nearly 200,000 men face each other across the Valley of Waterloo, representing every major power in Europe. French eagles, captured at battles from Austria to Russia, flutter above regiments that have marched from Madrid to Moscow. British colors, bearing battle honors from India to Egypt, mark units that have never known defeat under Wellington's command. The atmospheric tension builds like the approaching storm. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolls the hour 9 o'clock on a morning that will reshape the map of Europe. Napoleon, after conferring with his marshals, finally gives the order that has been delayed by mud and rain. The attack will begin. But first, a diversionary assault on the Château of Hougoumont, that brick and stone fortress that anchors Wellington's right flank. Prince Jerome Bonaparte, Napoleon's youngest brother, receives the honor of opening the battle. His division, composed largely of conscripts and veterans recalled from retirement, forms up for the assault on Hougoumont. The chateau itself, surrounded by formal gardens now trampled into mud, walls of red brick rising from landscaped grounds, represents everything that the French Revolution sought to destroy, aristocratic privilege made manifest in stone and mortar. Today, it will become a symbol of British tenacity. The garrison of Hougoumont consists of the light companies of the Coldstream and Scots Guards, elite troops chosen for their marksmanship and discipline. They have spent the night preparing their defenses, creating loopholes in the walls, barricading gates, and positioning themselves for the storm they know is coming. The gardener's house, the chapel, the barn, the manor house itself each becomes a fortress within a fortress, each room a potential killing ground. At precisely 11:30, French artillery opens fire on Hougoumont. The thunder of cannon echoes across the valley, announcing to all three armies that the Battle of Waterloo has begun. But this is not the massive bombardment that Napoleon usually employs to soften enemy positions. The wet ground and defensive positions limit the artillery's effectiveness, forcing the French to rely on infantry assaults supported by relatively light gunfire. The first French columns advance through the morning mist, their blue uniforms barely visible through the drifting smoke of their own artillery. They move with the steady pace of veterans, their officers walking beside them with swords drawn, encouraging their men forward into the approaching hell. The sound of their footsteps squelching through the mud creates a rhythm like a funeral march, punctuated by the commands of sergeants and the distant crack of musketry. The attack on Hougoumont begins not with a grand charge, but with the methodical advance of light infantry through the woods that surround the chateau. French tirailleurs, skilled skirmishers selected for their marksmanship, creep forward through the undergrowth, using every tree and bush for cover. Their targets are the British light infantry who have taken positions among the trees, beginning a deadly game of hide-and-seek that will continue throughout the day. The crack of individual muskets echoes through the wood, each shot representing a life hanging in the balance. French and British skirmishers stalk each other through the morning gloom, the mist and powder smoke creating a twilight world where death comes suddenly and silently. A flash of red uniform behind an oak tree, the glint of bayonet steel in the uncertain light, the soft thud of a body falling to the forest floor. This is warfare stripped to its most personal level. Lieutenant Colonel James MacDonnell of the Coldstream Guards watches from the chateau walls as his light company engages the French skirmishers. He knows that this preliminary sparring is merely the prelude to a much more serious assault. His men, veterans of the Peninsula campaigns, understand their role perfectly. They must hold Hougoumont at all costs, drawing French reserves away from the main battle line and providing a secure anchor for Wellington's right flank. The formal gardens of Hougoumont, laid out in the geometric patterns favored by French aristocracy, become a maze of defensive positions. Box hedges, once trimmed to perfection, now provide cover for riflemen. Ornamental ponds reflect the gray sky and the faces of soldiers preparing to die. Gravel paths, designed for leisurely evening strolls, will soon be slick with blood. The irony is not lost on the British defenders. They fight to preserve a French chateau against French soldiers, defending the old aristocratic order against the revolutionary forces that destroyed it. Inside the chateau's thick walls, the guards have created a fortress within a fortress. The main house, built of solid brick and timber, offers multiple firing positions from every window. The Great Hall, where French nobility once entertained guests with music and fine wine, now echoes with the sound of military preparations. Servants' quarters have been converted into ammunition depots. The wine cellar, still stocked with bottles laid down in better times, serves as a field hospital where wounded men will soon seek refuge from the storm above. Captain Wyndham of the Scots Guards positions his men in the garden wall's loopholes, gaps deliberately created in the brick barriers to allow enfilading fire along any assault route. Each loophole has been carefully sited to cover approaches that French attackers might use, creating overlapping fields of fire that will turn the garden into a killing ground. His men, their red coats darkened with morning dew, check their muskets one final time and settle in to wait. The French assault, when it comes, arrives with shocking suddenness. Prince Jerome's columns emerge from the wood line in perfect formation, their blue uniforms brilliant against the green backdrop of the Belgian countryside. The sound of their advance creates a new rhythm in the morning air, the steady tramp of infantry boots, the rattle of equipment, the shouted commands of officers directing their men toward the objective. 800 Frenchmen advance against fewer than 200 British defenders. But numbers mean nothing in the confined space of the chateau's defensive perimeter. The first volley from the garden wall tears through the leading French ranks like an invisible scythe. The British guards, firing from prepared positions at point-blank range, cannot miss. French soldiers drop where they stand, their cries lost in the thunder of musketry that reverberates between the chateau walls. But these are veteran troops, survivors of campaigns from Egypt to Austria, and they do not break under fire. Instead, they lower their heads and push forward, stepping over their fallen comrades to close with their enemies. Individual dramas play out along the garden wall as French soldiers attempt to storm the British positions. A French sergeant, his uniform torn by a musket ball that missed his heart by inches, rallies his men for a rush at the main gate. His voice, hoarse from shouting orders, carries clearly across the garden. En avant!
Pour l'empereur.
Behind him, young conscripts who have never seen battle summon courage they didn't know they possessed and follow their leader toward the British lines. The gate itself becomes the focus of desperate fighting. The British have barricaded it with furniture dragged from the chateau, massive oak tables that once hosted diplomatic dinners, chairs carved by master craftsmen, family portraits of nobles long since fled to England. Now these artifacts of aristocratic life serve as barriers against revolutionary vengeance, their polished surfaces soon to be splintered by musket balls and stained with the blood of common soldiers. French sappers, engineers trained in the art of siege warfare, work frantically to destroy the gate while British muskets fire down on them from the windows above. They place small charges of gunpowder against the hinges, working with the steady competence of men who have performed this task at a dozen other fortresses. The explosion, when it comes, sends splinters of ancient oak flying through the morning air, but the gate holds. British engineers have reinforced it during the night, turning it into a solid barrier that will require more than small charges to destroy. The French response is to attempt to scale the walls themselves. Ladders appear from nowhere, carried forward by soldiers who know that climbing them means almost certain death. The first man up each ladder faces not just British muskets but British bayonets, wielded by guards who have been trained to fight with the cold efficiency of professional killers. Yet still they climb, driven by the peculiar courage that makes ordinary men attempt impossible things in the heat of battle. From his position on the chateau roof, Lieutenant Legros of the French engineers spots what he believes is a weak point in the British defenses, a side gate that appears less heavily defended than the main entrance. Legros, nicknamed l'Enfonceur, the Smasher, for his success in breaking down enemy barriers, calls for volunteers to follow him in an assault on this secondary position. A dozen men answer his call, knowing that they follow a man whose reputation for success is matched only by his reputation for finding the most dangerous assignments. The assault on the side gate becomes one of the most famous individual actions of the entire battle. Legros and his men rush the position in a desperate charge, their bayonets gleaming in the uncertain morning light. They reach the gate just as the British defenders realize the danger and rush to reinforce the position. For a moment, it appears that the French might break through. Legros himself kicks open the gate and stands in the breach, his massive frame filling the opening while his men surge forward behind him. But the British response is swift and deadly. Corporal James Graham of the Coldstream Guards, a veteran of every major action in Spain, leads a countercharge that drives the French back from the gate. In the hand-to-hand fighting that follows, Legros falls, his body blocking the very entrance he sought to force. His men, seeing their leader dead, lose heart and fall back to the tree line, leaving behind a dozen bodies scattered in the churned mud before the gate. The temporary French withdrawal gives the British defenders time to strengthen their positions and treat their wounded. In the chateau's improvised hospital, regimental surgeons work by candlelight to save men whose wounds would be fatal without immediate attention. The smell of gunpowder mixes with the metallic scent of blood and the sharp odor of the chloride of lime used to clean wounds. Moans of wounded men create a counterpoint to the continuing sound of musketry from the walls above. Captain Wyndham uses the lull to redistribute his ammunition and check on his men's morale. He finds them grim but determined, understanding that their defense of this single building may determine the outcome of the entire battle. Word has reached them that similar attacks are being pressed all along Wellington's line, but their focus remains necessarily narrow-hold Hougoumont, whatever the cost. The French regroup for a second assault, this one more carefully planned and better coordinated. Prince Jerome, stung by the failure of his first attack, commits additional troops to the assault while calling for artillery support to blast the British from their positions. The problem is that artillery fire on Hougoumont risks destroying the building that the French hope to capture and use as a base for further operations. The decision is made to use lighter guns that can drive the defenders from the walls without completely destroying the structure. French artillery, positioned on the ridge overlooking the chateau, begins a systematic bombardment of the British positions. The sound of cannon fire rolls across the valley like thunder, each explosion sending clouds of brick dust and debris into the air. But the thick walls of Hougoumont, built to last for centuries, absorb the punishment without collapsing. Windows are shattered, roof tiles smashed, and decorative stonework reduced to rubble, but the basic structure remains intact. The bombardment does achieve one significant result. It forces many of the British defenders to take cover in the chateau's lower floors, reducing the volume of defensive fire. This creates the opportunity that the French have been waiting for. A new assault column, this one composed of the 1st Light Infantry Regiment, advances on Hougoumont with orders to take the position at any cost. These are not the raw conscripts of Prince Jerome's earlier attack, but seasoned soldiers who have fought in the campaigns of 1813 and 1814. They advance with the methodical precision of men who understand their business, their officers riding beside them on horses that step carefully through the mud and debris. Their approach creates a new sound in the morning air, the rhythmic chanting of Vive l'Empereur, that has echoed across a dozen European battlefields. The second assault on Hougoumont begins with a feint against the main gate, designed to draw British defenders away from other positions. While one company of French infantry charges the gate with loud cries and obvious determination, another circles around to attack the garden wall at its weakest point. This more sophisticated tactical approach reflects the French army's adaptation to the defensive capabilities they have already encountered. The feint succeeds partially. Some British troops move to reinforce the gate area, thinning the defense of the garden wall. But Lieutenant Colonel MacDonell has anticipated this possibility and held reserves in the chateau courtyard, ready to move wherever the threat appears greatest. As the real French assault develops against the garden wall, he leads these reserves forward, his sword flashing in the morning light as he rallies his men for what may be the decisive moment of the defense. The fighting along the garden wall becomes a series of individual duels, magnified by the confined space and the deadly nature of close-quarter combat. French soldiers, many of them veterans of the savage fighting in Spain, use every technique they have learned to break through the British positions. They fire their muskets at point-blank range, then charge with bayonets fixed, hoping to carry the position through sheer audacity. The British response demonstrates the disciplined courage that has made their army the most respected in Europe. Guards who have never retreated from any position maintain their firing positions even as French bayonets probe for gaps in their defenses. The sound of steel on steel rings across the garden as bayonets clash and men fight with the primitive ferocity that emerges when civilized warfare breaks down into its most basic elements. Private Joseph Brewster of the Scots Guards finds himself face-to-face with a French sergeant whose uniform bears the decorations of campaigns from Italy to Prussia. For a moment, the two men stare at each other across the distance of a bayonet thrust, each recognizing in the other a professional soldier who has seen too much of war to feel anything but respect for his opponent. Then training takes over and they engage in the deadly dance of close combat, each seeking the opening that will end the fight. The French sergeant's experience shows in his technique. He uses his bayonet not just as a spear but as a lever, attempting to bind Brewster's weapon and create an opening for a killing thrust. But Brewster, trained in the harsh school of Peninsula warfare, counters with moves learned in similar fights against French veterans. The engagement lasts perhaps 30 seconds, though it seems like hours to both participants, before Brewster's blade finds its mark and another French soldier falls in the mud of Hougomont's garden. Multiply this scene by dozens and the scope of the fighting becomes clear. All along the garden wall, British and French soldiers engage in combat that is both intensely personal and strategically vital. Each individual fight contributes to the larger battle for Hougoumont, which in turn affects the outcome of the entire Battle of Waterloo. The failure or success of these anonymous soldiers will be remembered by history, though their names will be forgotten. As the morning progresses toward noon, the intensity of the fighting around Hougoumont ebbs and flows like a tide. French attacks surge forward, gain ground, then recede in the face of British counterattacks. The garden, originally designed as a place of beauty and contemplation, becomes a landscape of destruction where flowers are trampled into the mud and ornamental trees are splintered by musket fire. The greenhouse, its glass panels reflecting the morning light in peaceful times, becomes a particular focus of attention. French soldiers attempt to use it as cover for an approach to the main house, while British defenders realize that the structure must be denied to the enemy. The resulting fight for control of the greenhouse sees some of the most vicious close-quarter combat of the entire battle, as men fight among the exotic plants and broken glass that were once the pride of the chateau's owners. Captain Charles Dashwood of the Coldstream Guards leads a desperate charge to clear the greenhouse of French infiltrators. His men advance through the shattered glass doors, their boots crunching on fragments that catch the uncertain light like scattered diamonds. Inside, French light infantry have taken positions among the tropical plants that somehow survived the battle's opening phases, palm fronds and orchid blooms providing incongruous decoration for a scene of primitive violence. The fighting in the greenhouse becomes a nightmare of confined spaces and deadly angles. French soldiers use the greenhouse's iron framework as cover, firing through gaps between the supporting struts while British soldiers attempt to root them out with bayonet charges down the narrow aisles between plant beds. The sweet scent of crushed flowers mingles with the acrid smell of gunpowder, creating an olfactory memory that will haunt survivors for decades to come. Sergeant William Wheeler of the 51st Light Infantry, temporarily attached to the Hougoumont garrison, finds himself trapped in what was once the orchid section, facing two French soldiers who have taken cover behind an ornate fountain. The water still flows, apparently undamaged by the battle, creating a gentle splashing sound that contrasts sharply with the crack of musketry echoing through the glass structure. Wheeler's tactical situation is desperate. He is outnumbered and caught in the open, but his experience in Spain has taught him that survival often depends on aggressive action rather than defensive hesitation. Wheeler's charge across the fountain area becomes one of those individual moments of courage that define battles. He runs directly toward the French position, his bayonet fixed and his voice raised in the war cry that British infantry have used from India to Europe. The two French soldiers, surprised by this frontal assault, fire their muskets but miss their target in their haste. Wheeler's bayonet finds its mark in the chest of the first Frenchman, while the second retreats deeper into the greenhouse, calling for reinforcements that may not arrive in time to save him. Meanwhile, in the chateau's chapel, a different kind of drama unfolds. The building's religious function has not protected it from the battle's violence. Musket balls have shattered the stained glass windows, turning biblical scenes into glittering fragments on the stone floor. French soldiers have attempted to use the chapel as a firing position, forcing British defenders to fight in a space consecrated to peace and prayer. Father Sampson, the chateau's elderly chaplain who refused to flee with the other civilians, finds himself ministering to dying soldiers of both armies. His white hair and simple black robes move between French and British wounded, offering what comfort he can to men whose allegiances mean nothing in the face of approaching death. His voice, speaking the last rites in Latin, creates a solemn counterpoint to the continuing sound of battle outside the chapel walls. The irony of fighting in a place of worship is not lost on the soldiers themselves. Corporal Timothy O'Brien of the Coldstream Guards, a Catholic from County Cork who joined the British Army to escape poverty, finds himself defending an altar while French soldiers, many of them also Catholic, attempt to storm the position. The crucifix above the altar, somehow untouched by the flying bullets, seems to watch the proceedings with the same divine sorrow that has witnessed human violence for 2 millennia. By noon, the battle for Hougoumont has settled into a deadly rhythm. French attacks surge forward, gain temporary footholds in the defensive perimeter, then fall back under British counterattacks. But each assault costs both sides casualties they can ill afford, and the mounting losses begin to tell on the defenders. Lieutenant Colonel MacDonell realizes that his garrison, originally numbering fewer than 200 men, has been reduced to perhaps half that number through casualties and the need to evacuate wounded men to safety. The most dramatic moment of the Hougoumont fight comes when French soldiers finally succeed in forcing open the main gate. A group of French guards, elite troops comparable to their British opponents, manage to break through the barricaded entrance and pour into the chateau's courtyard. For a moment, it appears that the position is lost. French soldiers spread out through the courtyard, seeking cover behind the various outbuildings while preparing to assault the main house itself. But Lieutenant Colonel MacDonell has prepared for this possibility. A small reserve force, hidden in the stables that border the courtyard, emerges to challenge the French penetration. The fighting that follows is the most intense of the entire Hougoumont action, as guards from both armies engage in close combat in the confined space of the courtyard. The sound of steel on steel rings between the buildings, punctuated by the cries of wounded men and the shouted commands of officers trying to maintain control in the chaos. The courtyard fight produces individual acts of heroism that will be remembered long after the battle ends. Corporal James Graham, the same man who helped repel the earlier French assault, leads a charge that drives the French back toward the gate. But as the enemy retreats, Graham realizes that the gate remains open and more French soldiers are preparing to enter. In a moment of inspiration born of desperation, he throws his full weight against the heavy wooden barrier, struggling to close it while French muskets fire at point-blank range. Graham's effort to close the gate becomes one of the most famous individual actions of the Battle of Waterloo. Other British soldiers, recognizing the critical importance of his task, abandon their own positions to help him. Together, a handful of guards manage to slam the gate shut and drop the heavy iron bar that secures it, sealing the breach just as additional French troops arrive to exploit the opening. Graham survives the action, though a French musket ball tears through his uniform and leaves a scar he will carry for the rest of his life. The closing of the gate marks the high tide of French success at Hougoumont. Subsequent attacks, though pressed with equal determination, fail to achieve even temporary penetration of the British defenses. The chateau's walls, strengthened by British engineering work during the night and reinforced by the debris of battle, prove impregnable to infantry assault. French commanders begin to realize that Hougoumont can only be taken by artillery bombardment heavy enough to reduce the buildings to rubble, but such bombardment would destroy the position's value as a base for further operations. As the afternoon approaches, the battle for Hougoumont gradually transforms from a series of direct assaults into a prolonged siege. French skirmishers maintain pressure on the British positions, firing from the cover of the woods and keeping the defenders alert, but the major attacks cease. This allows both sides to tend their wounded and assess the cost of the morning's fighting. The cost has been enormous. The formal gardens of Hougoumont, designed to showcase the beauty of nature tamed by human artistry, have been transformed into a landscape of destruction. Bodies lie scattered among the flower beds, their uniforms providing the only color in a scene otherwise dominated by the brown of mud and the gray of gunpowder smoke. The ornamental pond, fed by a spring that has flowed for centuries, runs red with blood. Gravel paths are torn up by the passage of desperate men, and ancient trees bear the scars of musket fire. Inside the chateau itself, the damage is equally severe. Windows are shattered, furniture destroyed, and walls pockmarked with bullet holes. The great staircase, once the pride of the building's architect, has been damaged by French soldiers attempting to fight their way to the upper floors. Family portraits, left behind in the hasty evacuation, stare down at scenes of violence that their subjects could never have imagined. But perhaps the most significant damage is to the men themselves. The British garrison that began the day with fewer than 200 soldiers has been reduced to perhaps 80 effective combatants. These survivors, their red uniforms darkened with dirt and blood, show the strain of prolonged combat in their hollow eyes and mechanical movements. They continue to function because training and discipline demand it, but the human cost of their defense is written in every line of their faces. The French losses are proportionally even greater. Prince Jerome's division, committed to what was supposed to be a diversionary attack, has suffered casualties approaching 50%. Entire companies have been destroyed in the assault on Hougoumant's walls, their survivors scattered through the woods or carried to the rear with wounds that will end their military careers. The tactical success of drawing British reserves to defend Hougoumont has been achieved, but at a price that calls into question the wisdom of the entire operation. Napoleon himself rides forward to observe the fighting at Hougoumont, his presence announced by the thunder of hooves as his staff gallops across the muddy field. From a position on the ridge overlooking the chateau, the emperor can see the full scope of the battle that has consumed the morning. Through his telescope, he watches British soldiers moving along the walls, their red uniforms standing out clearly against the brick and stonework of the buildings. The emperor's face reveals nothing of his thoughts as he studies the scene below. Hougoumont was supposed to fall quickly, drawing Wellington's reserves away from the main battle line and creating an opportunity for a decisive assault on the Allied center. Instead, the chateau has become a meat grinder that has consumed thousands of French soldiers without yielding the strategic advantage Napoleon requires. The delay caused by the prolonged fight for Hougoumont has given Wellington time to strengthen his positions and, more ominously, has provided additional hours for Blücher's Prussians to approach the battlefield. Marshal Ney, riding up to join the emperor's observation party, argues for a renewed assault on Hougoumont with fresh troops and heavy artillery support. His face, scarred by wounds received in Russia and Germany, shows the frustration of a commander whose tactical instincts tell him that the position can still be taken. But Napoleon, studying the broader tactical situation, begins to question whether Hougoumont is worth the additional cost required to capture it. The conversation between Napoleon and Ney, conducted in low tones while staff officers strain to hear, reveals the growing divergence between the two men who have led France through so many victories. Ney sees only the immediate tactical problem, how to break through British defenses that have proven unexpectedly strong. Napoleon, burdened with strategic concerns that extend far beyond a single battlefield, calculates the cost of victory against the time remaining before Prussian intervention makes victory impossible. While the French High Command debates strategy, the defenders of Hougoumont use the lull in major attacks to improve their positions and care for their wounded. Medical supplies, originally intended to last for a full day of fighting, have been exhausted in the morning's battles. Regimental surgeons work with improvised materials, using strips torn from officers' shirts as bandages and brandy looted from the chateau's cellars as both anesthetic and antiseptic. The chateau's kitchen, originally designed to prepare meals for elegant dinner parties, has been converted into an operating theater where surgeons perform amputations by candlelight. The massive wooden table where French chefs once created culinary masterpieces now serves as an operating table where British military surgeons fight their own battle against death and infection. The sounds emerging from this improvised hospital, the screams of men undergoing surgery without proper anesthesia, the desperate prayers of those who know they are dying create a counterpoint to the continuing crack of musketry from the walls above. Lieutenant George Evelyn of the Coldstream Guards, wounded in the leg during the morning's fighting but still capable of command, organizes the defense of the main house while Lieutenant Colonel MacDonell supervises the overall garrison. Evelyn's youth, he is barely 22 years old, contrasts sharply with the responsibility thrust upon him, but his performance under fire demonstrates the quality of leadership that has made the British officer corps the envy of Europe. From his position in the upper floors of the main house, Evelyn can see across the entire battlefield. The view reveals the true scope of the day's fighting. Hougoumont is only one of several desperate actions being fought simultaneously along Wellington's line. In the distance, smoke rises from La Haye-Sainte, another fortified position that anchors the Allied center. Artillery fire echoes across the valley as French guns attempt to break Wellington's main battle line, while British cannon respond with counter-battery fire that sends its own clouds of smoke drifting across the field. But Evelyn's immediate concern remains the defense of his own position. French skirmishers continue to probe the chateau's defenses, seeking weak points that might be exploited in a renewed assault. Their individual shots, fired from concealment in the woods, keep the British defenders alert and gradually wear down the garrison through casualties that, while individually minor, accumulate into a significant reduction in combat effectiveness. The psychological strain of prolonged defensive fighting begins to tell on both sides. British soldiers, accustomed to the aggressive tactics that served them well in Spain, find the passive nature of fortress defense frustrating and exhausting. They must endure French fire without being able to respond effectively, watching their comrades fall while remaining at their posts. The walls that protect them also confine them, making them feel trapped rather than secure. French soldiers experience their own form of psychological pressure. Repeated assaults on positions that have proven impregnable exact a toll that goes beyond physical casualties. Men who have never known defeat in 2 decades of European warfare begin to question whether Hougoumont can be taken at any reasonable cost. The sight of their own dead scattered through the chateau gardens serves as a constant reminder of the price of failure. As the sun reaches its zenith, marking the arrival of noon on this longest day of many men's lives, both sides prepare for what they believe will be the decisive phase of the battle. The morning's fighting has been costly and indecisive, but it has also revealed the strengths and weaknesses of both armies. The afternoon will bring new challenges and new opportunities as Napoleon attempts to break Wellington's line before Prussian intervention makes victory impossible. The bells of Waterloo village, somehow still audible above the sounds of battle, chime 12 times to mark the noon hour. It is a sound that connects this day of violence to the peaceful rhythms of normal life, reminding the soldiers that somewhere beyond the smoke and chaos, ordinary people continue to live ordinary lives. For the men fighting at Hougoumont, this reminder of normalcy seems to come from another world entirely. Napoleon's attention now turns from the stalled assault on Hougoumont to the broader tactical situation developing across the battlefield. The Emperor, his gray coat buttoned against the morning chill, rides along the ridge that provides observation over Wellington's entire position. His entourage follows at a respectful distance. Marshals whose faces bear the scars of 20 years of warfare, staff officers whose notebooks contain the details of campaigns that have reshaped the map of Europe, and the ever-present Imperial Guard whose mere presence on any battlefield has been enough to decide the outcome of dozens of engagements. But today, for the first time in his career, Napoleon feels the weight of time pressing against his plans. Each hour that passes without decisive action brings Blücher's Prussians closer to the battlefield. Each delay allows Wellington to strengthen positions that were already formidable at dawn. The emperor who once declared that he would rather fight 2 enemies separately than 1 enemy united now faces the possibility that his enemies will achieve the very unity that has always spelled disaster for French arms. Through his telescope, Napoleon studies the farmhouse of La Haye-Saint, positioned at the center of Wellington's line like a cork in a bottle. This modest Belgian farm, consisting of a main house, barn, garden, and orchard, commands the Brussels road and provides an observation point from which Allied artillery can direct fire across the entire French position. Unlike Hougoumont, which was intended as a diversion, La Haye-Saint must be taken if the French are to have any hope of breaking Wellington's center. The garrison of La Haye-Saint consists of the 2nd Light Battalion of the King's German Legion, professional soldiers who have served under British command since their homeland was overrun by Napoleon's armies years earlier. Major George Bering commands these 400 Germans with the bitter determination of men fighting to liberate their country from foreign occupation. They have spent the night transforming the farm into a fortress, cutting loopholes in the thick stone walls, barricading gates, and positioning themselves for the storm they know is coming. The sound that dominates the noon hour is not the crack of individual muskets or the clash of bayonets, but the deeper thunder of artillery. Napoleon's Grand Battery, 84 guns positioned on the ridge opposite Wellington's center, opens fire with a bombardment designed to shatter Allied morale and create gaps in their battle line. The sound is unlike anything heard before in human warfare, a continuous rolling thunder that seems to shake the very earth, punctuated by the crash of individual shots that arrive with the weight of divine judgment. Each cannon shot creates its own drama in the Allied ranks. A 12-pound ball, fired from a distance of 800 yards, arrives with enough velocity to tear through multiple ranks of infantry or dismount an entire gun crew. The psychological effect is as devastating as the physical impact. Men who have never experienced artillery fire on the scale struggle to maintain their discipline while the earth erupts around them in fountains of mud and debris. Wellington's response to the French bombardment demonstrates the tactical skill that has made him the most successful general in Europe. His infantry, positioned on the reverse slope of the Mont Saint-Jean Ridge, are largely protected from direct artillery fire. Only his skirmishers and gun crews remain exposed to the French cannonade, while the main body of his army waits in relative safety behind the crest of the hill. It is a defensive technique perfected during the Peninsula campaigns, turning French superiority in artillery into a wasted asset. But not all of Wellington's men can be protected from the French guns. The garrison of La Haye-Sainte, positioned forward of the main line to provide early warning and disrupt French attacks, bears the full weight of Napoleon's artillery. French gunners, recognizing the farm's strategic importance, concentrate their fire on the buildings with methodical precision. Round shot crashes through the stone walls, sending fragments of masonry flying through the air like shrapnel. The barn's thatched roof, dried by summer heat despite the morning's rain, catches fire and burns with a fierce orange flame that can be seen across the battlefield. Major Baring watches the destruction of his position with the calm professionalism of a soldier who has seen too much of war to be surprised by its cruelty. The farmhouse that served as his headquarters an hour earlier now stands roofless, its upper floors gutted by direct hits from French artillery. The garden where his men took their breakfast lies cratered by cannonballs. The vegetables that Belgian farmers planted in the spring now buried under tons of displaced earth. The men of the King's German Legion endure the bombardment with stoic determination, pressing themselves against the farm's thick walls while French shot tears through the air above their heads. These are veteran soldiers, survivors of campaigns from Egypt to Portugal, who understand that artillery bombardment is a prelude to infantry assault. They check their weapons, distribute ammunition, and prepare to sell their lives as dearly as possible when the French columns finally advance. The sound of the bombardment carries for miles across the Belgian countryside, announcing to every civilian within 20 miles that a great battle is being fought. In Brussels, windows rattle with each salvo while citizens who can afford to do so prepare to flee toward the coast. In Waterloo village itself, those inhabitants who have not already evacuated huddle in their cellars, praying that the battle will pass them by and leave their homes intact. But the most significant audience for Napoleon's artillery display may be the Prussian army still struggling through the muddy roads east of the battlefield. Field Marshal Blücher, his aged body racked by pain from his fall at Ligny, pushes his men forward with increasing urgency as the sound of French guns grows louder. Every minute of delay potentially costs Wellington thousands of casualties and brings Napoleon closer to the decisive victory that will force Prussia out of the war. The Prussian march toward Waterloo represents one of the most remarkable military movements in European history. An entire army, battered by defeat just 2 days earlier, reverses its line of retreat and marches toward the sound of the guns in support of an ally whose own survival hangs in the balance. The soldiers who struggle through the knee-deep mud of Belgian roads understand that they march not just to save Wellington's army, but to prevent Napoleon from regaining the initiative that might allow him to reconquer Europe. General Graf von Bülow, commanding the Prussian IV Corps that forms the advance guard of Blücher's army, receives increasingly urgent messages from his field marshal as the morning progresses. March to the sound of the guns, Blücher's orders read. Wellington must be supported at all costs. Bülow's men, their blue uniforms caked with mud and their equipment waterlogged from the night's rain, respond with the disciplined endurance that has made the Prussian army the most respected military force in Central Europe. Back at Waterloo, the French bombardment gradually shifts focus from counter-battery fire against Wellington's guns to preparation fire for the infantry assault that must follow. French gunners, working with the mechanical precision of men trained in the artillery schools that produced Napoleon himself, adjust their elevation and traverse to concentrate fire on specific sections of the Allied line. The technique is scientifically precise: first suppress enemy artillery, then disrupt infantry formations, finally create gaps that attacking columns can exploit. The Allied response reveals the fundamental difference between French and British approaches to warfare. Where Napoleon relies on the coordination of all arms to achieve breakthrough, Wellington depends on the individual courage and discipline of his soldiers to absorb punishment and maintain their positions. British infantry, formed in two deep lines that maximize firepower while minimizing vulnerability to artillery, wait behind the ridge with the patience of men who have learned to trust their commander's judgment. In La Haye-Sainte, Major Baring makes the tactical decision that will define his defense. Rather than attempt to hold the entire farm complex, he concentrates his garrison in the main buildings that offer the best protection from artillery fire and the strongest defensive positions for the infantry assault that must follow. The orchard, with its neat rows of apple trees now shattered by French shot, is abandoned to French skirmishers. The garden, once the pride of the Belgian farmers who owned this land, becomes a no-man's land where both sides will contest every yard of ground. The decision to concentrate the defense creates a fortress within a fortress, similar to the situation at Hougoumont but on a smaller scale. The main farmhouse, built of local stone and timber according to the solid construction methods of Belgian rural architecture, becomes the anchor point of the defense. Its thick walls can absorb direct hits from French artillery while providing firing positions for defenders. The barn, despite the loss of its roof to French incendiary shot, remains structurally sound and offers additional defensive positions. The first French assault on La Haye-Sainte begins with the advance of light infantry through the abandoned orchard. These tirailleurs, selected for their marksmanship and individual initiative, move from tree to tree in a deadly game of hide-and-seek with German defenders. Each apple tree becomes a piece of cover that might conceal a French soldier, each gap between trees a potential killing ground where accurate rifle fire can strike down an unwary defender. Rifleman Heinrich Weber of the King's German Legion, positioned in the farmhouse's upper floor, engages French skirmishers with the Baker rifle that has made British light infantry the most feared marksmen in Europe. His weapon, accurate at ranges that make French muskets useless, picks off French soldiers with methodical precision. Each shot requires careful aim and deliberate trigger control, creating a rhythm of warfare that contrasts sharply with the rapid volleys of massed infantry combat. The duel between individual marksmen in the orchard creates its own form of tactical drama. French and German soldiers, many of them veterans of the same campaigns and familiar with each other's techniques, engage in personal combat that tests not just marksmanship but psychological endurance. The man who exposes himself for the fraction of a second required to aim and fire risks death from an enemy who may be equally skilled and equally determined. Sergeant Klaus Müller, a veteran of the Peninsula campaigns who has fought French soldiers from Portugal to the Pyrenees, leads a section of German riflemen in the defense of the farm's garden wall. His experience teaches him to watch for the subtle signs that reveal enemy positions, the glint of metal in sunlight, the movement of vegetation that indicates human presence, the puff of smoke that marks a musket discharge. These skills, learned through years of skirmishing in the Spanish hills, now serve him in the very different terrain of Belgian farmland. The French response to German marksmanship is to increase the intensity of their artillery bombardment, concentrating fire on the farm buildings that shelter the most effective defenders. French 12-pounders, positioned on the ridge 800 yards away, fire solid shot that crashes through stone walls with devastating effect. Each direct hit sends fragments of masonry flying through the interior of the buildings, creating secondary projectiles that are often more deadly than the original cannonball. The sound inside La Haye-Sainte during the bombardment becomes a symphony of destruction that will haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. The crash of incoming shot mingles with the crack of splintering timber, the tinkle of falling glass, and the groans of men wounded by flying debris. Voices calling for ammunition, for medical assistance, for orders, create a counterpoint to the mechanical rhythm of French artillery that continues without pause. Major Bering moves through his position with the calm efficiency of a professional soldier, checking on his men's morale and adjusting his defensive dispositions as French fire gradually reduces his fortifications to rubble. His presence provides the human element that distinguishes disciplined resistance from mere stubborn courage. Each soldier who sees his commander moving calmly through the chaos draws strength from the example and finds the resolve to continue fighting despite the overwhelming odds. The barn becomes a particular focus of both attack and defense as French infantry attempts to use the structure as a covered approach to the main farmhouse. German defenders, recognizing the threat, concentrate fire on the barn's entrance while French soldiers attempt to reach positions inside the building that will provide firing positions against the house. The fighting for control of the barn involves room-to-room combat in a space filled with the smoke of gunpowder and the debris of agricultural life interrupted by war. Private Johann Schneider of the 2nd Light Battalion finds himself defending a position among the hay bales and farming equipment that represent the peaceful purposes this building served just hours earlier. The irony is not lost on him. He fights to prevent French soldiers from using tools designed for harvest to wage war against his comrades. A French soldier appears in the doorway, his musket aimed directly at Schneider's position, and for a moment the two men stare at each other across the distance that separates life from death. The engagement lasts perhaps 2 seconds, though time seems suspended in the moment before one of them pulls the trigger. Schneider's rifle fires first, the Baker rifle's superior accuracy proving decisive at close range. The French soldier falls, his musket discharging harmlessly into the barn's roof beams, and Schneider immediately begins the 30-second process of reloading that will prepare him for the next such encounter. While individual dramas play out in the farm buildings, the broader tactical situation continues to evolve as Napoleon commits additional forces to the assault on La Haye-Sainte. The French I Corps, commanded by General d'Erlin, forms up for a grand assault on Wellington's center that will use La Haye-Sainte as a stepping stone to break through. 20,000 French soldiers, organized in massive columns that stretch across the valley like moving forests of bayonets, prepare for what may be the decisive attack of the entire battle. The sight of d'Erlin's corps advancing across the valley creates one of the most magnificent and terrifying spectacles in military history. French columns, each containing thousands of soldiers, move forward with the mechanical precision of men trained to function as components of a larger military machine. Their blue uniforms create a sea of color against the green Belgian countryside, while the forest of bayonets above their heads catches the afternoon light like a field of deadly stars. The sound of their advance carries clearly across the battlefield. The rhythm of thousands of feet moving in unison, the jingle of equipment, the drums that beat the pas de charge that has echoed across a dozen European battlefields. French military bands, positioned between the columns, play the stirring martial music that has inspired French soldiers from Egypt to Austria. The combination of visual spectacle and musical accompaniment creates a psychological weapon as formidable as the physical threat posed by 20,000 bayonets. Wellington, observing the French advance from his command position on the ridge, recognizes the critical moment of the battle. If d'Erlin's assault succeeds in breaking through the Allied center, the entire position will collapse and Napoleon will achieve the decisive victory that has eluded him all morning. The Duke's response demonstrates the cool calculation that has made him the most successful general of his generation. He shifts reserves to threatened sectors while maintaining enough strength elsewhere to prevent French diversionary attacks from achieving their objectives. The men of La Haye-Sainte, watching the approach of overwhelming French numbers, understand that their small garrison faces annihilation unless relief arrives quickly. But they also understand that their resistance, however brief, may provide the time necessary for Wellington to organize his defenses against the main assault. It is the kind of tactical sacrifice that separates professional soldiers from mere armed civilians, the willingness to die not for immediate victory, but for the strategic advantage their deaths might provide to their surviving comrades. Major Bering's final preparations transform La Haye-Sainte from a defensive position into what military historians would later recognize as one of the most perfectly organized killing grounds in military history. Every loophole is manned by a marksman selected for his skill and reliability. Every approach route is covered by overlapping fields of fire that will force attacking French soldiers to expose themselves to deadly crossfire. Every building is prepared for demolition if capture becomes inevitable, denying the French the shelter they seek for their own operations. The German soldiers who wait in these positions understand that they face odds that make survival unlikely. They write final letters in the margins of Bibles, entrust personal effects to comrades who might live to deliver them, and make the kind of peace with death that allows professional soldiers to function effectively in hopeless situations. Their faces, visible in the uncertain light that filters through smoke and dust, show not fear but the grim determination of men who have decided to make their deaths count for something larger than themselves. As d'Erlin's columns approach the effective range of Allied artillery, Wellington's guns open fire with devastating effect. British 9-pounders, loaded with canister shot that transforms each cannon into a gigantic shotgun, tear gaps in the French formations that immediately close as rear ranks move forward to replace the fallen. The sound of massed artillery firing simultaneously creates a thunderclap that drowns out all other sounds on the battlefield. while the smoke from dozens of guns creates a gray curtain that obscures the advancing enemy from direct observation. French casualties from the artillery bombardment are enormous, but the columns continue to advance with the mechanical persistence of men trained to absorb punishment and maintain their mission. Gaps torn in the formations by Allied guns close automatically as surviving soldiers move forward to fill the spaces left by their fallen comrades. The sight of this disciplined advance under fire demonstrates the quality of troops that Napoleon has created through 20 years of continuous warfare. The assault on La Haye-Saint reaches its climax as French infantry, supported by artillery fire that has reduced much of the farm to rubble, closes with the German defenders. The final phase of the battle for this crucial position becomes a series of desperate hand-to-hand engagements as French soldiers attempt to storm the buildings while German riflemen fight from positions they know they cannot abandon. The sound of individual combat, steel on steel, the crack of rifle butts used as clubs, the cries of men locked in mortal struggle, creates a counterpoint to the broader symphony of battle that continues to rage across the valley. Major Bering, his uniform torn by a musket ball that passed within inches of his heart, continues to direct his men's resistance from the main farmhouse. Through the shattered windows, he can see French soldiers moving through positions that his men held just minutes earlier. The garden wall, carefully prepared with loopholes for defensive fire, has been overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The barn, its roof collapsed from artillery fire, shelters French infantry who use its ruins as cover for attacks on the house itself. But it is the failure of ammunition resupply that ultimately dooms the La Haye-Saint garrison. The Baker rifles that have made the King's German Legion so effective require a specific type of cartridge that differs from the standard British musket ball. As the afternoon wears on and casualties mount, the defenders find themselves with weapons they cannot fire and enemies they cannot stop. Major Bering's desperate messages requesting ammunition receive no response. The roads to his position are controlled by French forces, and Wellington's reserves are committed elsewhere along the line. The final assault on La Haye-Saint comes not as a coordinated attack but as the inevitable collapse of a defense that can no longer be sustained. German soldiers, their ammunition exhausted and their rifles reduced to clubs, fight with bayonets and personal weapons in the farmhouse rooms where they have spent the day. French infantry, recognizing that resistance is weakening, press their attacks with renewed vigor, knowing that victory is within their grasp. Rifleman Weber, the same marksman who had picked off French skirmishers in the morning's fighting, makes his last stand in the farmhouse kitchen where Belgian farmers once prepared meals for their families. His rifle empty and no cartridges remaining, he faces 3 French soldiers with only his bayonet and the knife he uses for field rations. The engagement that follows embodies all the desperate courage and futile heroism that characterizes the final moments of a doomed garrison. The fall of La Haye-Saint at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon represents a tactical disaster for Wellington's army and a potential strategic breakthrough for Napoleon's forces. The farm's capture provides French artillery with an observation post from which to direct fire against Wellington's main line, while French infantry gain a protected position within musket range of the Allied center. For the first time since the battle began, Napoleon has achieved a significant tactical success that might be exploited into decisive victory. Major Bering, wounded but still conscious, is taken prisoner as French soldiers overrun the last defensive positions in the farmhouse. His garrison, originally numbering 400 men, has been reduced to fewer than 50 survivors, most of them wounded. The cost of defending La Haye-Saint has been enormous, but the delay imposed on French operations may prove crucial to the battle's ultimate outcome. Every hour that Napoleon's forces spent reducing the farm's defenses was an hour gained for Prussian forces marching toward the battlefield. The French soldiers who finally capture La Haye-Saint express genuine admiration for the German defenders who held the position so tenaciously. Professional soldiers recognize courage regardless of the uniform it wears, and the resistance offered by the King's German Legion has earned the respect of enemies who have fought in campaigns from Spain to Russia. This mutual recognition between professional soldiers creates moments of humanity that transcend the larger political conflicts that brought them to this battlefield. Napoleon, observing the capture of La Haye-Saint through his telescope, recognizes that a window of opportunity has opened for the decisive blow that might still salvage victory from what has become an increasingly desperate situation. The time lost in reducing Hougoumont and La Haye-Saint has brought Prussian forces dangerously close to the battlefield. But if Wellington's center can be broken quickly, there may still be time to defeat one enemy before turning to face the other. The Emperor's decision to commit his cavalry reserves in a massive assault on Wellington's center reflects both the opportunity created by La Haye-Saint's capture and the growing desperation of French strategic circumstances. Marshal Ney, whose courage has never been questioned despite his recent tactical failures, receives orders to lead the greatest cavalry charge in military history, 10,000 French horsemen advancing in coordinated waves against British infantry squares that have never been broken by cavalry assault. The preparation for this massive cavalry attack creates one of the most magnificent spectacles in the history of warfare. French cavalry regiments, cuirassiers in their polished steel breastplates, dragoons with their flowing horsehair plumes, hussars in their brilliant uniforms that seem designed more for parade than battle, form up in lines that stretch across the valley like a living wall of horseflesh and steel. The sound of their preparation fills the afternoon air. The jingle of harness, the stamp of hooves, the voices of officers calling orders to men who may not live to see the sunset. Marshal Ney, mounted on his third horse of the day, the previous two having been killed under him, rides along the front of this magnificent formation. His uniform, once immaculate, now bears the stains of battle mud from the morning's rain, powder burns from close combat, blood from wounds that have not slowed his participation in the fight. His face, scarred by campaigns from the Rhine to the Niemen, shows the mixture of determination and desperation that characterizes a commander who knows he leads men into an assault that may be impossible to survive. The psychology of cavalry warfare depends as much on appearance as on tactical effectiveness. The sight of 10,000 horsemen advancing at full gallop creates terror that often breaks enemy formations before physical contact occurs. French cavalry has relied on this psychological advantage since the days of the Revolution, when elan and audacity compensated for deficiencies in equipment and training. But today they face British infantry that has learned to trust in disciplined firepower rather than individual courage, soldiers who have been trained to stand firm regardless of the magnificence of the spectacle bearing down upon them. Wellington's response to the French cavalry threat demonstrates the tactical innovation that has made British infantry the most respected foot soldiers in Europe. His regiments form squares, hollow rectangles with bayonets pointing outward in every direction, creating hedgehogs of steel that cavalry cannot penetrate. Each square contains several hundred men, whose muskets can deliver devastating volleys at any cavalry formation that approaches within effective range. The psychological strength of the square formation lies in its mutual support. Each soldier knows that his survival depends on the steadiness of his comrades, creating bonds of mutual dependence that make the formation stronger than the sum of its parts. The sound of Ney's cavalry charge begins as a distant thunder of hooves that gradually crescendos into the most terrifying noise that infantry soldiers can hear, the full-throated roar of a cavalry charge at maximum speed. 10,000 horses, their hooves striking the wet ground in an irregular rhythm that creates a sound like continuous thunder, carry their riders toward British positions at a speed that makes defensive preparation almost impossible. The French battle cry, "Vive l'Empereur," rises above the thundering hooves, creating a wall of sound that seems to push physically against the Allied lines. But the wet ground that delayed Napoleon's initial attack now works against French cavalry, just as it handicapped French artillery in the morning. Horses that should be moving at full gallop struggle through mud that reaches their fetlocks, reducing their speed and tiring them before they reach British positions. The magnificent charge that was designed to overwhelm through sheer momentum becomes a labored advance that gives British defenders time to prepare their response. The British squares that receive the French cavalry charge stand like islands of red in a sea of blue and steel. Each formation presents a forest of bayonets that no horse will willingly approach, while the muskets behind those bayonets prepare to deliver point-blank volleys that will empty dozens of French saddles with each discharge. The discipline required to maintain these formations under cavalry attack represents the highest achievement of 18th-century military training. Men must stand motionless while death approaches at 30 miles per hour, trusting in their comrades and their training rather than their own instincts for survival. Captain William Saborn of the 52nd Light Infantry, positioned in a square near the center of Wellington's line, watches the approach of French cavalry with the professional interest of a soldier who has studied the theory of such encounters but never experienced the reality. His men, veterans of the Peninsula campaigns, check their muskets and adjust their positions with the mechanical efficiency of soldiers who trust their training more than their emotions. The sound of approaching hooves grows louder with each passing second, but the square maintains its formation through discipline that has been hammered into these men through years of drill and battle. The collision between French cavalry and British squares creates individual dramas that illustrate the larger tactical situation. French horsemen, magnificent in their courage and futile in their tactics, ride directly at British bayonets that cannot be broken by mounted assault. Horses, more intelligent than their riders in recognizing the impossibility of the task, refuse to charge directly into the steel hedge, creating confusion in the French ranks that British musketry exploits with devastating effect. Colonel Dubois of the 2nd Cuirassiers, his steel breastplate polished to mirror brightness despite the day's fighting, leads his regiment in a desperate attempt to break the British square commanded by Captain Saborn. His horse, a magnificent black stallion trained for cavalry warfare, approaches the British position at full gallop until instinct overcomes training and the animal refuses to impale itself on British bayonets. Dubois, thrown from his saddle by the sudden stop, finds himself on foot among British infantry who show him the professional courtesy of allowing him to surrender rather than killing him where he stands. The failure of individual cavalry charges does not discourage French commanders from repeating the attempt with fresh regiments and modified tactics. Wave after wave of French horsemen thunder across the valley toward British positions, each attack demonstrating magnificent courage and tactical futility in equal measure. The sound of these repeated charges creates a rhythm of warfare unlike anything previously heard on European battlefields. The thunder of hooves, the crash of musket volleys, the cries of wounded horses and dismounted riders, all repeated in cycles that mark the passage of the afternoon. Between cavalry charges, British squares endure French artillery fire that cannot be answered effectively. Napoleon's guns, repositioned to support the cavalry attacks, pour shot into formations that cannot disperse without becoming vulnerable to the next mounted assault. British soldiers must stand in rigid formation while cannonballs tear through their ranks, closing gaps automatically as men fall and maintaining discipline that seems superhuman to observers who are not themselves under fire. Private Thomas Morris of the 73rd Highland Regiment of Foot experiences the psychological strain of standing in square formation under artillery bombardment while waiting for the next cavalry charge. The sound of incoming shot creates a distinctive whistle that allows experienced soldiers to judge whether a particular cannonball will strike their formation. But the knowledge provides little comfort when the ball arrives with enough force to tear through multiple ranks of men. Morris, a veteran of campaigns in Egypt and the Peninsula, finds that his previous combat experience has not prepared him for the sustained terror of remaining motionless under fire. The Highland Regiment Square, positioned near the Brussels road where it can observe the entire battlefield, becomes a focal point for both French attacks and British defense. The regiment's distinctive uniforms, red coats and blue bonnets that mark them as Scottish soldiers fighting for a cause that transcends national boundaries, make them conspicuous targets for French artillery, while their reputation for steadiness in battle makes them a crucial anchor point for Wellington's defensive line. Colonel Cameron, commanding the Highland Regiment, moves calmly through his square during lulls between French attacks, checking on wounded men and maintaining the morale that keeps his formation intact. His presence provides the human element that distinguishes disciplined resistance from mere stubborn endurance. Each soldier who sees his colonel moving unperturbed through the chaos draws strength from the example and finds the resolve to maintain his position despite the overwhelming pressure of repeated enemy attacks. The afternoon sun, breaking through the clouds that have dominated the morning sky, illuminates a battlefield transformed by hours of continuous combat. The green fields of Belgian farmland have been churned into mud by the passage of thousands of men and horses, while the smoke of artillery and musketry creates a gray haze that obscures distant objects and gives the entire scene a dreamlike quality. Bodies of men and horses lie scattered across the valley, marking the path of French attacks and the effectiveness of Allied resistance. But it is the sound of the battlefield that most clearly reveals the intensity of the fighting. The crack of musketry, continuous now rather than sporadic, mingles with the deeper boom of artillery and the cries of wounded men calling for assistance that may not come. Voices shouting orders in French, English, German, and Dutch create a polyglot chorus that reflects the international nature of the conflict, while the screams of wounded horses add an element of animal suffering to the human tragedy unfolding across the valley. Wellington himself, mounted on his favorite horse Copenhagen, rides along his defensive line with the calm efficiency that has made him the most trusted commander in the Allied army. His presence at critical points during French attacks provides moral support that may be more valuable than additional reinforcements, while his tactical adjustments, shifting reserves to threatened sectors, repositioning artillery to cover weak points, demonstrate the professional competence that has never failed him in 20 years of active service. The Duke's ability to appear unperturbed by the chaos around him stems partly from experience and partly from a philosophical acceptance of the uncertainties inherent in military command. He has fought in enough battles to understand that tactical plans rarely survive contact with the enemy, and that success often depends more on the ability to adapt to changing circumstances than on the brilliance of original concepts. His calm demeanor in the face of repeated French assaults provides a stabilizing influence that ripples through the entire army. As the afternoon progresses toward evening, both sides begin to show the strain of prolonged combat at maximum intensity. French cavalry, after repeated charges that have achieved local successes but no strategic breakthrough, begin to show signs of exhaustion that go beyond physical fatigue. Horses that began the day in magnificent condition now struggle to maintain formation, while riders who started the battle with supreme confidence in their ability to break any enemy formation begin to question the possibility of victory through mounted assault alone. British infantry, despite their success in repelling French attacks, face their own crisis of endurance. Ammunition supplies, carefully calculated for a day's fighting, begin to run low as continuous combat consumes cartridges at rates that peacetime planning never anticipated. Medical services, overwhelmed by the volume of casualties, can provide only the most basic treatment for wounds that would receive careful attention under normal circumstances. Water supplies, contaminated by the debris of battle and the presence of dead bodies, create new health hazards for men already weakened by hours of intense physical and psychological stress. It is at this critical moment, when both armies approach the limits of their endurance, that the sound of distant artillery fire begins to be heard from the east. The Prussian army, after a day-long march through conditions that would have stopped a less determined force, finally approaches the battlefield in sufficient strength to influence the battle's outcome. Field Marshal Blücher, his aged body supported in the saddle by sheer will and pharmaceutical assistance, leads his men toward the sound of the guns with the grim satisfaction of a commander who has kept his word to an ally in desperate need. The psychological impact of Prussian intervention extends far beyond the actual military strength that Blücher's advance guard brings to the battlefield. For Wellington's army, the knowledge that help is approaching provides the moral strength necessary to continue resistance against odds that have seemed overwhelming throughout the afternoon. For Napoleon's forces, the appearance of fresh enemy troops on their flank creates a new threat that must be countered with resources that are already stretched to the breaking point. The French emperor, observing Prussian forces through his telescope as they deploy on the eastern edge of the battlefield, faces the strategic nightmare that has haunted his planning since the campaign began. His army, committed to a decisive battle against Wellington, must now fight on two fronts against enemies whose combined strength exceeds his own. The window of opportunity for decisive victory, narrow since morning and closing throughout the afternoon, now threatens to slam shut entirely unless immediate action can reverse the tactical situation. Napoleon's response to Prussian intervention demonstrates both his strategic genius and the limitations imposed by his current circumstances. He detaches a significant portion of his army to face the new threat while maintaining pressure on Wellington's line with forces that are no longer adequate for breakthrough operations. It is a classic example of the principle that military commanders must sometimes choose between certain defeat and possible victory, accepting risks that peacetime analysis would consider unacceptable. General Lobau, commanding the French Sixth Corps, receives orders to establish a defensive line facing east, while the main army continues operations against Wellington. His men, already tired from the morning's march and the afternoon's fighting, must now prepare defensive positions against an enemy whose strength and intentions remain uncertain. The morale impact of this new deployment ripples through French ranks as soldiers begin to understand that they face not just British resistance, but a coordinated Allied response that threatens to overwhelm French capabilities. The sound of Prussian artillery, still distant but clearly audible to experienced ears, adds a new element to the battlefield's acoustic environment. French soldiers who have grown accustomed to the rhythm of combat against British forces must now adjust to the psychological pressure of fighting enemies who attack from two directions simultaneously. The confidence that has sustained French morale throughout the day's fighting begins to erode as the tactical situation becomes increasingly complex and dangerous. As evening approaches, the Battle of Waterloo enters its final phase with all three armies locked in combat that will determine not just the day's outcome, but the future political organization of Europe. Napoleon, his strategic options narrowing with each passing hour, prepares for the desperate gamble that has characterized his entire career, the commitment of his Imperial Guard in an assault that must succeed or end French hopes of victory forever. The Imperial Guard represents more than just another military unit. It embodies the legend and mystique of Napoleon's empire. These are the men who marched with the Emperor from Austerlitz to Moscow, who have never known defeat in 20 years of European warfare, who carry on their regimental colors the names of victories that have reshaped the map of the continent. Their mere presence on any battlefield has been enough to decide the outcome of dozens of engagements, and their reputation for invincibility has become as much a weapon as their muskets and bayonets. But tonight, for the first time in their illustrious history, the Imperial Guard will taste defeat. Napoleon himself rides to the Guard's position, his presence causing a stir of excitement through ranks that have followed him across Europe and back. The Emperor, his gray coat muddy from the day's riding, his face showing the strain of commanding a battle that has not gone according to plan, addresses his most trusted soldiers with words that carry the weight of 20 years of shared glory. "The Guard advances," he announces, and with those three words commits his last reserve to an assault that must either break Wellington's line or end the Napoleonic era forever. General Cambronne, commanding the Guard infantry that will spearhead the attack, forms his men for what he knows may be their final charge. These veterans, their blue uniforms bearing the scars of campaigns from Egypt to Austria, prepare their equipment with the methodical care of professionals who understand the magnitude of their task. Each man carries 60 rounds of ammunition, a full water bottle, and the confidence that comes from never having been defeated in battle. Tonight, that perfect record will be broken forever. The advance of the Imperial Guard across the Valley of Waterloo creates one of the most dramatic moments in military history. 800 men, organized in a column that seems to absorb the evening light and transform it into something darker and more threatening, march toward Wellington's Ridge with the steady pace of men who have never known retreat. Their regimental band plays the Marseillaise, the revolutionary anthem that has accompanied French victories across Europe, while drummers beat the pas de charge that has struck terror into the hearts of enemies from Madrid to Vienna. The psychological impact of the Guard's advance extends far beyond their actual military strength. Across the battlefield, French soldiers who have fought all day without decisive success take heart from the sight of Napoleon's elite troops moving forward. British defenders, exhausted by hours of repelling French attacks, understand that they face the ultimate test of their endurance and discipline. The very air seems to vibrate with tension as Europe's most famous military unit advances toward what may be the most important combat engagement in modern history. Wellington, observing the Guard's approach through his telescope, recognizes the critical moment of his military career. Everything he has accomplished in India, Spain, and Portugal has led to this moment, the defense of a ridge in Belgium against an enemy whose reputation for invincibility has never been challenged. The Duke's response demonstrates the tactical genius that has made him the most successful general of his generation. Instead of meeting the Guard with a frontal defense, he positions his troops to deliver enfilading fire from concealed positions that will maximize the impact of British musketry. The 1st Foot Guards, Wellington's own elite infantry, take position on the reverse slope of the ridge where they remain invisible to the advancing French. These men, veterans of the Peninsula campaigns and equals in training and experience to Napoleon's Guard, understand that they carry the hopes of the entire Allied army. Their colonel, Sir Peregrine Maitland, moves among his men with quiet words of encouragement that emphasize duty rather than glory. Tonight, they fight not for conquest but for survival. As the Imperial Guard climbs the slope toward Wellington's position, individual French soldiers begin to distinguish British defenders who have remained hidden throughout their approach. The sight of red uniforms emerging from concealment creates a moment of tactical surprise that disrupts the psychological momentum of the French attack. For the first time in their careers, Napoleon's invincible guard find themselves facing an enemy that has been waiting for them with prepared positions and concentrated firepower. The collision between the Imperial Guard and Wellington's elite infantry creates a moment of pure military drama that will be remembered as long as wars are fought. French soldiers who have never retreated from any position find themselves facing British troops whose discipline and training equal their own. The exchange of musket volleys at point-blank range creates casualties on both sides that exceed anything either unit has experienced in previous battles, while the sound of massed infantry combat echoes across the valley like the voice of war itself. Captain Henri Dubois of the 1st Grenadiers, his uniform bearing decorations from Jena and Wagram, leads his company up the slope with the confidence born of 20 victories. His men, their tall bearskin hats making them appear even more formidable than their reputation suggests, advance with the mechanical precision of soldiers who have performed this same evolution on a dozen European battlefields. But tonight, they face defenders who refuse to yield ground to reputation alone. The British response to the Guards' assault demonstrates the evolution of infantry tactics that has made Wellington's army the most effective defensive force in Europe. Instead of meeting the French attack with a countercharge, British troops deliver controlled volleys from prepared positions that maximize their firepower advantage. Each company fires in sequence, creating a continuous cycle of musketry that keeps constant pressure on the attacking French while allowing individual units to reload without creating gaps in the defensive fire. Sergeant William Thompson of the 1st Foot Guards, a veteran of Talavera and Salamanca, directs his section's fire with the calm professionalism of a man who has faced French attacks before and learned to trust in disciplined musketry rather than individual heroics. His voice, carrying clearly above the crash of gunfire, calls out the targeting commands that transform his men from individuals into components of a killing machine designed to stop the best infantry in Europe. The sound of combat between elite units creates an acoustic signature that differs noticeably from the earlier fighting. These are professional soldiers at the peak of their training and experience, and their combat produces the rapid, controlled volleys that mark disciplined infantry warfare rather than the sporadic firing of less experienced troops. The crash of massed musketry mingles with the ring of bayonets as the two forces close to distances where individual courage matters more than tactical formation. Private Jean-Baptiste Laurent of the Guard, wounded in the thigh by a British musket ball but still advancing, embodies the spirit that has made the Imperial Guard legendary throughout Europe. Despite his wound, despite the devastating fire that has torn gaps in his company's formation, despite the growing realization that this attack faces resistance unlike any in the Guard's previous experience, he continues forward with bayonet fixed and determination undimmed. His advance represents the collision between unstoppable force and immovable object that defines this climactic moment. The moment when the Imperial Guard's advance finally halts marks the psychological turning point of the entire battle. For the first time in their history, Napoleon's elite troops find themselves unable to break through enemy resistance. British defenders, their red uniforms now darkened with mud and powder smoke, maintain their positions despite pressure that would have broken less disciplined troops. The sight of the Guard's advance slowing, then stopping, then beginning to waver, sends shock waves through both armies that will determine the battle's ultimate outcome. General Cambronne, seeing his lead companies faltering under British fire, attempts to rally his men for a renewed assault. His voice, hoarse from shouting orders above the din of battle, calls out the battle cries that have inspired French soldiers from the pyramids to the Kremlin. But tonight, for the first time, his words cannot overcome the reality of tactical failure. The Guard, bloodied and shaken by their encounter with Wellington's infantry, begins the retreat that will end Napoleon's military career forever. The retreat of the Imperial Guard creates a psychological catastrophe that spreads through the French army like wildfire. Soldiers who have never seen the Guard retreat, who have built their confidence on the certainty of Guard invincibility, suddenly find their world turned upside down. The cry, "La Garde recule," the Guard retreats passes through French ranks with the force of a physical blow, destroying morale that has sustained the army through a day of desperate fighting. Napoleon himself, witnessing the failure of his last reserve, experiences the moment that every great commander dreads: the realization that all tactical options have been exhausted and defeat is inevitable. The Emperor, his face showing emotions that his staff has never seen before, watches his most trusted troops streaming back down the slope they had climbed with such confidence just minutes earlier. For a man who has controlled the destiny of Europe for 2 decades, the sight of the Guard in retreat represents not just tactical failure but the end of an era. Wellington, observing the wavering of the French attack, recognizes the moment for which he has waited all day. The Duke, rising in his stirrups so that his entire army can see him, waves his hat above his head in the signal for a general advance. Across the Allied line, infantry that has stood on the defensive throughout the day begins to move forward, their advance creating the momentum that will transform tactical success into strategic victory. The sound of Wellington's advance differs markedly from the French attacks that have characterized the day's fighting. Instead of the concentrated assault of formed columns, the Allied advance spreads across the entire battle line, creating a wave of movement that the weakened French army cannot hope to contain. British drums beat the advance while Highland pipes add their wild music to the martial symphony that announces the beginning of the end for Napoleon's army. The 52nd Light Infantry, positioned on Wellington's left wing, leads the advance with the aggressive tactics that have made British light infantry the most feared skirmishers in Europe. Their rapid movement forward, supported by the steady advance of line regiments, creates pressure on the French flank that spreads rapidly toward the center of Napoleon's position. Colonel Colborne, commanding the 52nd, demonstrates the tactical initiative that characterizes Wellington's most trusted subordinates by exploiting opportunities as they develop rather than waiting for specific orders. As the Allied advance gains momentum, the retreat of the Imperial Guard transforms into a general French withdrawal that threatens to become a complete rout. French units that have maintained their organization throughout the day's fighting begin to dissolve as individual soldiers seek safety in flight rather than maintaining formation for organized resistance. The sound of the retreat, the clatter of abandoned equipment, the cries of officers attempting to rally their men, the thunder of artillery being abandoned to avoid capture, marks the collapse of an army that began the day confident of victory. Marshal Ney, still mounted despite having lost multiple horses during the day's fighting, attempts to organize a rearguard action that might allow the army to retreat in good order. His efforts, heroic in their futility, demonstrate the personal courage that has made him legendary throughout Europe even as they highlight the impossibility of his task. The army that he attempts to rally has passed beyond the point where individual leadership can restore organizational coherence. The pursuit that follows Wellington's advance creates scenes of chaos that contrast sharply with the disciplined combat that characterized earlier phases of the battle. French soldiers, many of them veterans of campaigns across Europe, flee in disorder that destroys the military reputation built over 20 years of victory. Equipment that represents millions of francs in imperial investment lies abandoned across the countryside as men choose individual survival over collective resistance. Napoleon's personal escape from the battlefield requires the sacrifice of his remaining reserves and the abandonment of his imperial baggage train. The Emperor, whose personal effects include the symbols of power that have defined his rule over Europe, must choose between maintaining his imperial dignity and preserving his life. The coach that carries the imperial treasure, the ceremonial weapons that mark his authority, the correspondence that documents his control over European affairs, all must be left behind as the price of avoiding capture. The night that follows the Battle of Waterloo brings an end to more than just a single day's fighting. As darkness falls over the Belgian countryside, the survivors of 3 armies begin the process of counting costs that extend far beyond immediate casualties. The Napoleonic Wars, which have convulsed Europe for more than 2 decades, end not with negotiated peace, but with the complete military defeat of the man whose ambitions have reshaped the continent. The silence that gradually settles over the battlefield carries a quality different from the normal quiet of a rural evening. This is the silence of exhaustion and finality, broken only by the moans of wounded men and the sounds of medical personnel searching for survivors among the thousands of bodies that cover the field. The moon, breaking through clouds that have dominated the sky since dawn, illuminates a landscape transformed by human violence into something that will haunt the dreams of survivors for decades to come. Wellington himself, riding across the field in the darkness to assess the cost of victory, encounters scenes that test even his experienced composure. Bodies lie in formations that mark the tide lines of the day's fighting. French infantry fallen in the geometric patterns of their attack columns. British soldiers who died maintaining the square formations that saved their army. Cavalry from both sides scattered where charges met defensive fire. The Duke, whose tactical genius has achieved one of the most complete victories in military history, finds that success tastes bitter when measured against its human cost. The farmhouse of Waterloo, which gave its name to this battle, becomes the site where Wellington composes his dispatch announcing victory to the British government. The message, written by candlelight in a room where civilians cowered during the day's fighting, employs the understated language that characterizes official military correspondence, but cannot conceal the magnitude of what has been accomplished. The enemy's attack was repulsed at all points. The Duke writes, though those simple words describe events that have changed the course of European history. The cost of victory becomes apparent as casualty reports reach Wellington's headquarters throughout the night. The British Army alone has suffered over 15,000 casualties, while Allied losses bring the total to nearly 25,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. French casualties, difficult to calculate because of the army's dissolution, probably exceed 30,000 including prisoners taken during the pursuit. These numbers, stark in their simplicity, represent human suffering on a scale that few battles in history have equaled. Among the British dead lies General Sir Thomas Picton, the Welsh general whose aggressive leadership characterized Wellington's most successful Peninsula campaigns. His death, leading his division forward during the afternoon's fighting, represents the loss of military talent that cannot be replaced through promotion or training. The sight of Picton's body, found among his men who died following him into combat, provides a personal dimension to strategic victory that reminds even the most senior commanders of war's ultimate cost. The French retreat continues throughout the night as Napoleon's army dissolves into fragments that seek safety in individual survival rather than collective resistance. Roads leading away from the battlefield become clogged with abandoned equipment as soldiers discard everything that might slow their escape. Artillery pieces worth fortunes in national treasure stand empty beside highways where their crews have fled, while wagons full of supplies that could sustain armies for weeks are left to Allied pursuers. Prussian cavalry, relatively fresh compared to troops that have fought all day, leads the pursuit that ensures French defeat becomes French catastrophe. General von Gneisenau, commanding the Prussian advance guard, drives his men forward with orders to give no quarter to an enemy that has ravaged Prussia for 2 decades. The pursuit continues through the night and into the following day, destroying the last remnants of French military organization and ending any possibility of Napoleon's recovery. The emperor himself, separated from his army and protected only by a small escort, begins the journey that will end in his final exile to St. Helena. The man who once controlled the destiny of 50 million Europeans now travels as a fugitive whose freedom depends on the mercy of enemies he has fought for 20 years. His career, which began with artillery command in the French Revolution and reached its zenith with control over most of continental Europe, ends on a muddy road in Belgium where imperial grandeur yields to the basic necessity of avoiding capture. As dawn breaks on June 19, 1815, the sun rises over a battlefield that has determined the fate of Europe for generations to come. The Battle of Waterloo, fought on fields that returned to agricultural use within months, has ended the career of the man who dominated European politics for 2 decades and established a balance of power that will last for a century. The cost of this achievement, measured in thousands of young men who will never see home again, provides a reminder that even the most necessary wars exact prices that can never be fully calculated or completely justified. The legacy of Waterloo extends far beyond its immediate military consequences. The battle establishes principles of international cooperation that will influence European diplomacy for generations, while demonstrating that no single individual, regardless of genius or ambition, can indefinitely dominate the collective will of nations determined to preserve their independence. The muddy fields where 3 armies fought to exhaustion become a symbol of the point where individual ambition must yield to collective resistance. This was not just the end of a battle. This was the end of an era. The silence that settles over Waterloo as the last shots fade into memory carries within it the end of 20 years of European warfare and the beginning of a peace that will last until the children of these soldiers have children of their own. In the growing light of a new day, Europe begins to count the cost of Napoleon's ambitions and to build the institutions that will prevent any single individual from again threatening the continent's stability. The transformation from the thunder of battle to the silence of aftermath marks more than the passage from war to peace. It represents the transition from one age of European history to another. The weapons that decided this battle, the tactics that proved successful, the political arrangements that made victory possible, all belong to an era that is ending even as the smoke clears from the field. The future will bring new challenges, new weapons, new forms of warfare, but none will carry the personal drama and individual consequence that characterized the Napoleonic Wars. And so the Battle of Waterloo ends not with the crash of artillery or the cries of charging cavalry, but with the gentle silence of a Belgian morning where farmers will soon return to fields that have been briefly borrowed by history. The great drama has concluded, the actors have departed, and the stage returns to its original purpose: the quiet cultivation of crops that will feed peaceful populations in a Europe finally freed from the ambitions of one man's imperial dreams.